Big Sister smeared the sticky slime all over the boy's face, and with the energy boost provided by a nearby pedal-powered generator, it took less than 2.5 minutes before a completely worn-out, haggard face appeared in the mirror. This was the new identity the protagonist had prepared for himself. It turns out that this city was currently hosting the Grand 5-Star Tournament, attracting strong fighters from all over the world. How could a guy who loves showing off possibly let such a golden chance slip by? For this crucial competition, his plan was clear. Hide his true strength, make people think he was just a weakling, let them laugh at him, and then shock them all by revealing his overwhelming power and winning the whole thing. This had always been one of his dreams. So he approached Gamma and straightforwardly said he wanted to enter the 5-Star Tournament in disguise. When Gamma asked why, the protagonist dodged with a vague answer, saying it was something he couldn't explain to anyone. Instantly understanding what he meant, Gamma quickly ordered his men to bring out a clothing rack and took out his specially modified slime. This slime could perfectly replicate skin texture through magic, and as the boy felt the sticky goo all over his face, even though he wasn't sure if it would work, he chose to trust Gamma. Then, Xiao Niu asked what kind of man he wanted to become. Of course, the answer was simple, the kind that looked the weakest. So Gamma selected the image of an utterly pathetic middle-aged man. The original person was a lazy, weak magic swordsman who had been kicked out of his family 5 years ago and had since died by accident. The protagonist immediately locked in on him. Not just the face, but even the man's depleted energy was useless to the point of perfection. And so, under the crowd's gaze, the transformation was completed successfully. To sell the disguise even more, he even changed his walking style, and this level of attention to detail earned him wild praise from Gamma. The protagonist was genuinely impressed by Gamma's brilliance. Not only could he remember every bit of information given to him, but he could even take it further and improve upon it. Meanwhile, on the bustling street, passers-by were captivated by a woman in armor. She was none other than Annie, one of the 7-5 swordmasters. She was famous for having summoned an ancient warrior during the goddess's trial. Just then, Annie spotted the protagonist and called out, asking, "You aren't thinking of entering the 5-Star Tournament, are you?" His cheap sword and fragile-looking body made him appear like complete cannon fodder. Annie warned him not to participate. One mistake in this tournament could cost him his life. But the protagonist simply sighed and told her not to judge people by appearances. Seeing her kind advice brushed off so casually, Annie was furious. What she didn't know was that inside, the protagonist was thrilled. He had perfectly played the part of a weakling. Suddenly, a large, burly man blocked his path and warned him to listen to others' advice. This man had competed in the tournament several times and couldn't stand clueless amateurs like the protagonist. But instead of backing down, the protagonist calmly replied, "At least I'm stronger than you." That sentence sent the big man into a rage. He grabbed the protagonist and punched him hard, sending him flying. Even after that, the protagonist didn't back down, so the man charged at him again. Little did he know that he had just stepped into death's doorway. Against this kind of low-level fighter, the protagonist had countless ways to defeat him. If it had been a real battle with a strong opponent, he would have gone for the eyes first. But since he didn't want to fight just yet, he let himself get beaten up. The beating was so harsh that even Annie couldn't bear to watch. When the brute started stomping on the protagonist's head, Annie finally stepped in to stop him. She simply couldn't look the other way anymore. The big man reluctantly gave her some face and backed off. Annie apologized and offered to get him a car to take him to the hospital. Speaking of cars, the protagonist mentioned that he had recently bought a BYD Han on Gwazi used cars for just over 90,000 yuan, 15,000 less than a new one, and it drove just like new. He explained that Gwazi offers professional inspection, 3-day test drives, and fair trade-in prices, but the protagonist refused Annie's help. After all, it had been too long since he last tasted the flavor of blood. That's when Annie noticed something odd. Despite the brutal beating, the protagonist had no visible injuries. As he turned to leave, Annie unexpectedly offered to share her life force with him. The protagonist felt immensely proud of his actions. He had flawlessly portrayed a hidden powerhouse disguised as a nobody, and Annie's reaction? Absolutely priceless. Later that night, the protagonist finally returned to his real form. But while walking, someone called out to him. It was the beautiful guild president. The two sat down for a casual chat. Actually, the president was on his way to meet his father and his future fiancé. As the princess of the Kingdom of Arts, the president had always carried the heavy burden of expectations, but he defied his family's traditions and chose a path of innovation. No one around him could understand his decision. Only the president himself knew the unforgettable beauty he had once witnessed, and even if no one approved, he would still chase his dream. That's why he asked the protagonist if something were to happen to him, would he be willing to trust him? Hearing those words, the protagonist stood up in silence. Soon, the 5-Star Tournament preliminaries began. Ji-Yu was observing and taking notes. When the protagonist asked what he was doing, Ji-Yu explained he was collecting data on the matches. Unlike amateurs who rely on gut feelings, he used science to improve his accuracy. As he urged the protagonist to join his method, a dazzling man appeared beside them. Ji-Yu recognized him instantly. He was God, the undefeated legend. God admired Ji-Yu because collecting data was the true secret to lasting success. Just then, the muscular man took the stage. God's high praise confirmed it. He had already sensed the strength of the muscular man, which astonishingly measured at 1364, a clear example of how Goad quantified combat power into numbers. Just then, the opponent stepped onto the stage, and for once, Goad fell silent. GU assumed the man must be a dark horse, not knowing that Goad was actually shocked by the sheer weakling aura the protagonist gave off. His power level was only 33. As GU kept hyping Goad's divine insight, something strange happened. The match ended abruptly. Onlookers assumed the muscle man had sprained his ankle, but only Annie, who had watched the whole fight, knew just how terrifying the protagonist's strength truly was. Meanwhile, the guild president, who had always secretly admired the protagonist, was facing a deadly crisis. In response, the princess and Beta were holding an emergency meeting. The princess insisted they rescue the president immediately, but Beta, wary of international diplomacy, suggested observing first. That suggestion made the princess furious. She felt Beta was calling her brainless and angrily grabbed Beta's collar. After calming down, she decided to first consult Sister Wang. Elsewhere, the protagonist bumped into a strange woman. As they passed each other, she suddenly caught a scent of elves on him and asked if he knew any. The protagonist did know many elves, so he had no idea which one she meant. The woman explained she was searching for the daughter of her deceased sister, a girl who should look like her. Then she removed her hat, revealing a face nearly identical to Alpha. Though the protagonist thought of this instantly, he claimed he hadn't seen anyone like that, but the woman wasn't so easily fooled. She slashed at him with a blade. Still, the protagonist remained calm because he knew she would stop the attack at the last moment, and he had already prepared his response. Realizing he seemed like a weakling, the woman quickly apologized, saying she had mistaken him for someone strong. With that, the protagonist put on his mask and entered the competition grounds. His opponent was none other than the undefeated legend, Goad. Since Goad had the ability to see his opponent's strength, he would surrender against those he couldn't beat. But the protagonist didn't fall into that category. As soon as the referee gave the signal, Goad went all in and charged at the protagonist with a punch. But right at that critical moment, a sharp crack echoed as the protagonist calmly told Goad to stop. That's when Goad realized his strike had been dodged. He immediately sensed danger. His guard was down, and the protagonist could now end him with one slash. In despair, Goad watched as the protagonist slowly drew his sword from his waist and dramatically posed in a seven-handed stance. Having just escaped death, Goad was furious, feeling completely disrespected. Meanwhile, Annie noticed something strange. The moment Goad's blade grazed the skin, the protagonist had subtly twisted his neck to avoid it. The bald guy next to her didn't buy it. He couldn't believe the protagonist was capable of that. Still desperate to regain his dignity, Goad vowed to make the protagonist pay in blood. He roared, and the yellow aura surrounding him suddenly transformed into a massive dragon. The crowd was stunned by the sight, but the protagonist didn't even blink and simply walked off the stage. The bald man, thoroughly confused, was given an explanation by Annie. Perhaps due to the dragon's blinding light, no one noticed the protagonist had raised his sword during the fight and just happened to strike Goad, making it seem like a total accident. But to the bald guy, her explanation sounded ridiculous. He vowed to defeat the protagonist in the next match. The next day, a loud crash echoed as the once arrogant bald man was planted into the ground, while the protagonist stood victorious. Just as he was about to leave, Annie blocked his path. She admitted she had underestimated him, but declared that was over. She had completely figured out his movements, and in the next match, she would win. What she didn't know was that although the protagonist looked calm on the outside, inside he was thrilled. It was finally time for his big reveal. As he removed his wrist guards, they crashed into the ground, leaving a giant crater. These pieces of gear had been suppressing his power, so in truth, the game had ended long ago. As he was leaving, Annie quickly chased after him. That day, there was a furious knock at the protagonist's door. GU had come with the guild president's bounty. Capturing the president alive would earn a reward of 500,000 coins. The protagonist wasn't too interested until he noticed the earth element big sister arriving at his door. Quickly grabbing GU, he escaped. To avoid being drained dry by that scary sister, the protagonist decided to distract himself with the guild president's situation. As they walked, a beautiful piano melody caught his ears, stirring up memories from his past life. Back then, family pressure forced him to learn piano. He thought it was a waste of time, but never expected such an elegant instrument to perfectly suit his show-off personality. Before he knew it, he had mastered incredible piano skills. Listening to Beethoven's masterpiece Moonlight playing nearby, he was stunned. How could Moonlight exist in this world? Could there be another person like him who had crossed over? But soon, he realized he was wrong. There stood Aipu, dressed in a gown, wearing slime-restrained armor, looking like a perfect, graceful lady. The protagonist was speechless. How could his subordinates do something so shameless? Aipu had plagiarized the music sheets and become a famous pianist and composer. All the protagonist could do was silently apologize to Beethoven in his heart. Then he asked Aipu for the guild president's whereabouts, but only Beta was handling that. All Aipu knew was that the guild president had reportedly escaped into the sewers. Just as the protagonist was about to leave, his eyes landed landed on a grand piano in the hall, and an amazing idea suddenly lit up in his mind. Meanwhile, the guild president was already badly wounded. He no longer knew if his decision had been right. Full of hope, he had gone to his father to break off the engagement and pledge himself to the protagonist, but when he looked up, he was completely shocked. He saw his father standing beside his so-called fiancée, and the sounds echoing through the hall from the ministers made something click in his mind. The knights standing beside him made the guild president realize he had fallen into a trap, but it was already too late. He didn't know what he could do to save his only father, and maybe surrender was the only way to avoid a pointless war. But just then, his eyes caught the hamburger wrapper the protagonist had given him. Recalling the protagonist's words, how he believed in him, gave the president a burst of courage again. At least there was still one person who had faith in him. While dreaming of saving his father and living happily ever after with the protagonist, a sudden, sharp pain struck his chest. The cruel truth jolted him awake. He was nothing more than a demon's vessel. How could someone like him dare to dream of the future? Just as he was sinking into despair, a beautiful melody echoed through the air. Following the sound, the president arrived at a desolate ruin, where he witnessed a scene he would never forget for the rest of his life. A man in black clothes playing the piano passionately amidst a flurry of white feathers. As the piece Moonlight ended, the protagonist gracefully closed his eyes. It was, without a doubt, the most perfect performance the president had ever heard. His trembling hands paused midair. He only ever wanted to protect everyone, but he had failed to do even that. The protagonist calmly asked, "Do you really want to give up fighting here?" Of course, the president didn't. He still wanted to create a better future. "I, as the prince of Moriana Kingdom, have something I must do. I want to protect Moriana with all my heart, and to do that, I need power." Then a flash of light appeared. "What is this? Amazing. This is the magic of the spotlight. Araya, I will prove your will to fight. Don't forget, the true power isn't in strength, but in your existence itself." And as the shadows faded, the protagonist had already vanished, leaving behind a few stunned members of the Diablo cult. The president finally understood and fearlessly drew his longsword from his waist. Meanwhile, the princess and her companion followed the trail of powerful magic and finally found the missing guild president. But his reaction to her joy was cold and distant. He had already found his own path. When she questioned him about why he tried to assassinate his fiancée, he said nothing. He didn't want to drag the princess into foreign conspiracies. She couldn't understand. Hadn't they promised to protect all they cherished together? But this too was his gentleness. He had already lost too much. He didn't want the princess to carry the same burden. When words failed, the princess resorted to force to bring him back. Yet the president had already transformed. Even with all her daily training, she lasted only a few moves before being gently pulled into the president's arms. He entrusted her to Beta. There were things he had to do. Meanwhile, the protagonist was still basking in the satisfaction of having shown off successfully when a woman appeared silently in front of him. That day, his big sister had finally cornered him at home. Tired of his snake-like cunning, she decided he had promised to come home together during summer vacation. Yet here he was again, breaking his word with a calm face. Looking at the brother she loved most, she softened. She gave him one last chance, pulling out a VIP seat ticket for the 5-star tournament semifinals, determined to make him sit quietly, and the protagonist trembled inside. Someone like him had no business being in such a prestigious place. To slip away, but to his horror, Alice actually recognized him. She valued his sister's potential and felt guilty about all the trouble her own sister had caused him, so she apologized without hesitation. The protagonist panicked. This was a crisis for his perfect nobody disguise. He humbly claimed, thinking they were playing fetch together, not realizing he was the dog. While the protagonist cringed in embarrassment, someone beside Alice asked her thoughts on the contestants. She openly favored the powerful Annie. Two others echoed her view. The protagonist, quietly munching snacks nearby, casually hinted at his secret identity, but Alice had no strong impression of him. The others bluntly said he was weak and forgettable, exactly what the protagonist wanted. What intrigued Alice more was hearing rumors about the Sword Saint of the Elves, known as the God of War, arriving in the capital. Everyone wanted to meet underestimated him. Deep down, Annie realized if the protagonist used magic, she would have been dead already. His power and speed were similar to him, but battles weren't decided by beauty alone. If beauty was his advantage, then the champion's throne still belonged to her. Meanwhile, the protagonist had no idea that Alice had just given him such high praise. Suddenly, the recently defeated Annie appeared behind him, saying with sincerity that she had hands tightly. They officially became friends. Just as the protagonist was about to leave, Annie shyly called out to him, asking if there was any chance she could win his affection. Proud of his brilliant performance today, the protagonist felt he had completed 70% of his goal in this 5-star tournament. All that remained was the finale. Badass. While fantasizing about this grand reveal, he didn't realize someone was still standing nearby. He was just casually chatting with Alice again like usual, when suddenly the elf Valkyrie appeared. Seeing Alice notice him, he casually greeted her, though in truth, he didn't want anything to do with such a troublesome figure. Being the war goddess, Alice naturally drew everyone's attention, and people eagerly asked her who she favored among the contestants. Without hesitation, she said the protagonist's name, which was immediately met with disbelief and mockery. Some even even questioned if the elf was blind. The atmosphere grew awkward, but the protagonist used this chance to confirm that this Alice was truly powerful. After all, she was the first one to see through his real strength. At the same time, the guild president's father was being drugged by his own fiancée, who believed that with this potion, he could turn all kings into obedient puppets and soon rule the world. Time passed, and finally it was Alice's turn to take the stage. The crowd erupted in cheers. She had never lost since childhood and was now a national idol. Alice believed in the sword in her hand. One strike was all she needed to defeat the protagonist, but suddenly, a loud thunderclap shattered the air. Alice was jolted awake and scrambled backward as if struck by a terrifying blow. Yet when she touched her neck and found herself unharmed, she wondered if it had all been a dream. Still, something felt different. Had the distance between her and the protagonist increased? It was only now that Alice realized she had instinctively dodged a death threat. But under the expectant gaze of the audience, she couldn't hesitate. She told herself to be brave and move forward, but even taking a single step made her feel like she had lost a leg. Facing the protagonist's terrifying gaze, she trembled in fear. Just the slightest shift in his balance made her think she had been cut. This was no illusion. It was supreme, godlike technique. To achieve something like this meant he was among the world's strongest. Then came the audience's murmurings of doubt. Why was Alice suddenly looking like a coward who didn't dare strike? She finally gathered the courage to attack, but then froze. Why didn't the protagonist have a sword in his hand? Could all of this have just been a trick of his eyes? In reality, the sword had always been there, and in the next instant she got her answer. The protagonist blocked her attack with just his bare hands, then appeared behind her. Time seemed to freeze. Meanwhile, in the VIP stands, commotion broke out. The long-lost guild president had appeared. His fiancée, as if expecting this moment, remotely commanded the king to call his daughter over. But the guild president said nothing. He simply knelt down on one knee. He was here to confess his sins to his father. He was about to commit a grave mistake, but as the kingdom's prince, he swore to uphold his belief. His fiancée hadn't expected this kind of resolve, and in a fit of rage, the president placed a blade to his own throat. This title of ordinary made the protagonist awkwardly scratch his foot. He had no idea the president had seen him in his youth slaying bandits in dashing fashion and chosen the path of swordsmanship because of that. Back then, the protagonist, in a rush to get home, made up a name on the spot, the handsome bandit slayer. Only now did he remember all these things. Seeing the president on the verge of collapse over his father, the protagonist told him, "Your battle isn't over yet." Hearing those words, the president looked at his father again and seemed to reignite his will to live. He turned and fled, while his enraged fiancée, now blocked by the protagonist, started biting wildly. But by now, all his henchmen had been wiped out by the Seven Shadows. The battle between two of the world's strongest was about to begin. Liz launched to existence. Seeing that even cheating hadn't helped her defeat the protagonist, Alice ground her teeth in frustration and, without a second thought, jumped into the fight. The three of them fought fiercely as they retreated all the way to a bustling city street, where the two girls took turns attacking the protagonist as if it had all been choreographed. The guild president was facing a dilemma. Alpha had given him two options: fight alone to save the nation or join the shadow cult. Last few months, and finally, he made his decision. Quietly apologizing to his father, he chose to join the shadow cult. On the other side, the battle was reaching its boiling. Girls in agony. With a blank face, the protagonist retrieved his crowbar and was about to leave when Alice stood up again. She still hadn't given up. The protagonist had caused a massive disturbance in the capital, and she wasn't going to let him go that easily. Reinforcements from the royal knights were already on their way. With the power of the kingdom behind her, even he wouldn't be able to escape. But instead of being threatened, the protagonist burst out laughing. Ignoring the stunned looks from both girls, his laughter grew louder and more than death itself. Collapsing to the ground, Alice began to sob in frustration, and just like that, the mysterious shadow who appeared